Chapter 27, Spatial Distribution of Species and Ecosystems. Section 27.4, Plant Succession. So plant succession is something that occurs after a disturbance. And we're going to treat it just from the perspective that it involves plants, but it also involves animal organisms. So what is plant succession? Well, it's a directional, non-seasonal cumulative change in the types of plant species that occupy a given area through time. And succession begins with disturbance. It involves the processes of plant colonization, establishment, and extinction, which act on the species that participate in the succession. Now we know that disturbance can partially or completely remove vegetation. Some things that can cause disturbance include fire, windstorms, volcanic eruptions, logging, climate change, severe flooding, disease, or pest infestations. Now, succession begins with the original plants that occupied a habitat being removed by the disturbance, and then it ends when species change over time stops. And at that time, we reach something called the climax community. So succession stops when species composition changes no longer occur with time, the climax community. What's important about succession is you see the same pattern of change in plant species with each disturbance event in a particular ecosystem type of plants. So in boreal forest, every time a disturbance occurs, the pattern of change in the composition of the plants in that community is identical or very similar until you reach this state called the climax community, when the composition of the plants occupying the habitat no longer changes. So for example, in the boreal forest, one species that comes in, usually after a couple of years after fire removes species and kills off trees, is fireweed. So it's a common occurrence, right? If you go from one burn area to another burn area, and it's a couple of years after the burn, you'll see fireweed located on the ground surface. Now, the concept of a climax community where the composition of the plants occupying the habitat no longer change, it suggests that we've reached a stable equilibrium. And this idea was examined by several different researchers in the beginning of the 20th century. One famous researcher that studied climax community, studied succession in many different types of plant communities was Frederick Clements, a U.S. ecologist. And he thought that the final stage of succession, this climax community, was tied through cause and effect to climate. And it was quite a common event, right? So this suggests that succession and the process that occurs and its endpoint is a very deterministic notion. But by the 1950s, enough evidence accumulated from other research projects that many scientists began viewing succession as a phenomena where the climax state is rarely reached, that equilibrium rarely occurs because disturbances are so frequent. So equilibrium is rarely reached in this latter idea because of the nature of disturbance. Disturbance is common, acting on a variety of spatial and temporal scales, and always causing change to the composition of a plant community. Sometimes the disturbance is big and it's a major change. Sometimes the disturbances are small and it's a minor change. So the current notion is that succession is in plant communities is actually composed of a whole bunch of different small patchy disturbance events, and within these patches, succession is occurring at different stages. One excellent research project done to study succession was done by the ecologist Dwight Billings in the 1930s. In his study, he examined the recolonization of natural vegetation on abandoned farms in North Carolina. And what he saw was the abandoned farms went from what was once cropland to a climax state where these plots of land would be occupied by mature oak forest after about 100 years. So in North Carolina, there was a lot of abandoned farms because of economic reasons, and Dwight Billings was able to date when the farms were abandoned. Some of these farms were abandoned only a few years ago, and others were abandoned approximately for about 150 years. So what he found was that there were these stages of development in terms of the succession, 5 different stages. In the first stage, the pioneering species that quickly moved into the habitat after the crops were no longer being grown on the bare ground were annual plants. Plants that were easily dispersed, quick to germinate, and were able to grow on pretty much nutrient-poor soils. The annual plants were then replaced after about a year or two by biennial plants and grasses. After about 3 to 4 years, perennial herbs and shrubs took over on these abandoned fields. These plants lived for many years and had the ability to reproduce several times over their lifespans. So what we've just described is the first 3 stages in this succession from abandoned field to mature oak forest with other species of hardwood trees. So annual plants after 1 year, after a couple of years, perennial plants and grasses, and then after about 3 to 4 years, shrubs become the dominant plants occupying the habitat. After about 5 to 15 years, trees, softwood trees, begin to germinate beneath the shrubs. And the type of trees that were found in these habitats included loblolly pine, shortleaf pine, Virginia pine, and sweet gum. The maturing softwoods produced a forest canopy over time, which reduced light levels that were able to penetrate through the foliage of these trees and caused the perennials to die out and some of the shrubs to die out because they required higher intensities of light. So in this diagram where we're now at the 4th stage, softwood trees and pines. Underneath these softwood trees and pines, germination of hardwood tree species began to occur. These hardwood species required conditions where there was higher buildup of nutrients in the soil and moisture conditions that were more favorable. The pine trees produced a more humid environment beneath their canopy. The litter layer built up. This allowed the germination of hardwood species like oak, quercus, and various species of hickory. Seedlings of these trees tolerated low light levels, so they were adapted to that. And the hardwood trees began replacing the softwood species by about 50 to 75 years. So their canopies were much more thicker, allowed less light to penetrate. They were a little taller than the pine species, and the pine species began to die out because they just weren't receiving enough light for photosynthesis. Oak and hickory can live for more than 100 years, and sites more than 100 years old were dominated by almost pure mature oak forests with other hardwood species like hickory located with them. So here we see a picture of the forest floor in the end of the succession where it's dominated by the oak hickory forest. Researchers discovered that there was more to the plant succession process than they thought. In fact, there was different types of succession. For example, a primary succession is the establishment of plants on previously unoccupied habitat. So a habitat that was devoid of vegetation. There was no seed bank in the soil for plants to germinate from. The plants had to blow into these sites by wind or be carried into these sites by animals, and they germinated. A secondary succession is where the plants establish themselves on a previously occupied habitat. In a secondary succession, you get a disturbance, but the disturbance really doesn't wipe out the seed bank in the soil. So the seeds that are in the soil, they germinate and they lead to the plant succession, which is different than in a primary succession. So here we see a primary succession. So the ash that fell after Mount St. Helens was many, many meters thick. There was essentially no seed bank for plants to establish themselves from. So all the plants that came in, they were coming in by wind, being carried by birds, carried by animals walking into this region, and so on. So the plants did not establish themselves from the soil that existed at the site. Here is an example of a secondary succession. This is from Okanagan Mountain after the Okanagan fire. And we can see the grasses developing. And this is just a couple of years after the fire. Trees are dead. And those grasses, they're growing from the seed bank that was in the soil. And if we took a closer look, we would see other shrubs, herbs, and maybe some trees germinating within that ground layer. An allogenic succession is a succession that is caused by an environmental change. So this is supposed to occur because of in the future because of climate change, that plant communities are going to change because of changing climate. We're going to lose boreal forest, and it's going to be replaced by grassland in Canada as the grasslands march northward. An autogenic succession is a succession controlled by the establishing species. So these species cause an environmental change, which then leads to the colonization and establishment of other species. In the Douglas fir forests of British Columbia, one species that shows up after disturbance occurs and wipes out all the trees Douglas fir trees is red alder. And we now know that this stage is really important because red alder, it has the ability to form symbiotic relationships with bacteria to fix nitrogen, and they play a very important role in building up the nitrogen in the soil. And in order for Douglas fir to germinate, there has to be high levels of nitrogen in the soil for the seedlings to survive. Researchers have also noticed that there are particular abiotic and biotic changes that occur during succession that occur all the time. For example, in the early stages of succession, pioneering species, the first species that enter this disturbed habitat, tend to be small, short-lived species that grow fast. And remember, we called these species in another lecture are selected species. Late successional species tend to have large biomass, they're long-lived, and they grow slowly. And of course, we call these case-selected species. Late successional species tend to be complex. They have many adaptations that they use to survive in their habitat. Late successional species have high photosynthetic efficiency. They can grow well in low light levels, which is important if you have to germinate under an already established canopy of shrubs or early successional trees. In most successions, soil nitrogen builds up. It increases with the successional stage or age of the habitat that is experiencing succession. Early successional species tend to have small, easily dispersed seeds, which would be an advantage to getting into habitat that has become newly disturbed and open for colonization and establishment. Late successional species often have large seeds, and these seeds are poorly dispersed. Early successional species tend to be good competitors for soil nutrients and water, but poor competitors for light. And that's usually what causes their die-off is species grow above them, other plant species that shade them, and they don't get enough light to support the photosynthesis they need for their metabolism. Plant diversity tends to increase with time in succession. So later stages of succession tend to have many more different types of species, plant species, occupying the habitat than early stages. Early plants tend to be ruderals. Late plants tend to have a competitive strategy. So this is related to grind strategies of plants. Okay, now what causes succession? So three mechanisms have been identified. Sometimes these mechanisms act alone, or sometimes they act together, either together as pairs, or three different mechanisms occurring, all three mechanisms occurring at once. These mechanisms are called facilitation, tolerance, and inhibition. So let's look at the facilitation model of succession first. It suggests that the developing plant community changes the abiotic environment. Thus, the entry and growth of later species depends on earlier species preparing the ground. So we saw that with Douglas fir. They need red alder to come into the habitat after a disturbance, build up the nitrogen levels in the soil quickly, and then they can germinate and grow. The tolerance model suggests that a predictable sequence is produced because of different species have different strategies for exploiting resources. With the two main resources being exploited or used by these plant species being light and soil nutrients. Early species tend to be good competitors for soil nutrients, but poor competitors for light. And species that are later in the successional sequence tend to be good competitors for light, but poor competitors for soil nutrients. They need soil nutrients to be in excess availability in order to survive. Okay, the inhibition model applies when all species resist invasions of competitors. It's sometimes referred to as a model that involves the competition of space. And the reason why certain species accumulate with succession is because they have longer lifespans. And they gradually accumulate in a statistical sense by replacing early individuals which have short lifespans. So early species are killed by old age and very local disturbances caused by extreme physical conditions or the action of predators. So the following slides will show you how this works. So let's pretend we have 3 species. Species 1 lives for 1 year on average, so it's an R-selected species. It produces lots of seeds, and the seeds can show up in 60% of the vacant sites available after a disturbance or the death of individuals growing in the habitat. Species 2 lives for 5 years, but on average its seeds germinate in only 30% of the vacant sites. And then species 3 is our long-lived species, our more K-selected species. It lives for 10 years, but it produces big seeds, poorly dispersed. These seeds only end up in about 10% of the vacant sites. So here we have 2 diagrams showing the environment, the habitat, I should say. And in this habitat, let's pretend we have 25 different sites where a seed can germinate. Now, according to the ratio shown above, species 1, after the first year of after a disturbance, should occupy about 60% of the sites, and that's what I've got here. Species 2 should occupy about 30%, and species 3 should be in about 10% of the sites. So roughly, if there's 25 sites, roughly 2 to 3 sites, and I've got 3 here. So after year 1, because species 1 only lives 1 year, they all die out, and those sites that they once lived in are now available for new seeds to colonize and establish themselves. Now the ratios that these 3 different species are going to establish themselves in those open sites is going to be still 60%, 30%, 10%. So here we get year 2 germination. So, you know, a couple more sites are being occupied by 2s and a couple more by 3s, less 1s. We get die off after year 2. So the second, or the species 2 doesn't die out because it lives for 5 years. Species 3 doesn't die out because it lives for 10 years. But all of the species 1 die out, and we have some sites available. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 sites available for the species to come and colonize and germinate in. So in those 9, we should expect 10% will be 3s, 30% will be 2s, and 60% will be 1s. And so we show a year 3 germination on the bottom at the left, and then after year 3 death, notice that all the 1s died, but the 2s and 3s can still carry on. But now we have only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sites open. And what happens as time continues on, here we have year 4, then year 5, year 6, and then finally let's stop at year 7. And if we compare year 7, what species are occupied in the sites compared to year 1, we see that what we get is, because these species have different abilities to disperse and have different lifespans, the 3s begin to dominate over time. They begin to occur in more and more of the sites that are available. and that is inhibition model of succession. So basically what we're looking at is a lottery model built on statistical chance.